reparenting, and it comes out of parenting. And a big part of parenting is helping children begin to understand consequences. That every action, every thought has a consequence. It could be a good consequence, could be a bad consequence, but consequences are naturally built into everything we say and do. Now, there's challenges with children, and that's why parenting is so important in helping a child understand this. And the first is that the limbic brain, that is the child's brain, that's the brain the child operates out of, it only thinks in terms of instant gratification. It doesn't think in terms of long-term consequences. And so it becomes so important for parents to begin to help a child understand that there are long-term consequences, not just immediate consequences that have to be considered. The second thing that can come out of some child's growing up experience is when they experience a consequence, it's because mom and dad punished them. It's because mom and dad said, if you do this, you'll be sorry, because then I'm going to ground you, I'm going to whatever. And so to them, consequences are only enforced by authority figures on the outside. They don't think in terms of natural consequences. They only think in terms of people in authority imposing consequences. And so what can come out of that thinking is, well, if I don't get caught, then there's no consequences. So they don't think in terms of natural consequences. So it's a huge challenge for parents to begin to help a child understand that natural consequences are part of life. So here's kind of how it works out in parenting. So a child, let's say, tells a lie, or they're just lazy all the time, don't want to be responsible. And the parent knows, okay, there's going to be natural consequences for this child lying. They may not experience them today or next week or next month. It might be years before they really experience the full consequences of lying or being lazy or not being responsible. But those consequences will come. But I don't want this child to think that being lazy and lying is a good thing and that they're glad they're doing it, because I know there's long-term consequences, though the child hasn't figured that out yet. So I need to help this child stop lying and save them from years of heartache. Stop being lazy and save them from years of heartache. So what can I do? And so what a parent will do is impose an immediate consequence for lying. So the natural consequence will come, but it's going to take time. And so to train the child, I'm going to impose, as the authority figure, a consequence that is fair, that has enough pain, that the child realizes, I don't want to keep lying. This is not a good thing to do because I get in trouble. And that is what a wise parent would do, is find a consequence that's appropriate for the unhealthy behavior that gives immediate pain to the child, that makes them go, okay, I'm going to stop doing this behavior. And then 20 years down the road, they go, wow, I'm glad mom and dad gave me that consequence. I'm glad mom and dad stopped me from lying back then, because it sure has saved me a lot of heartache. Mom and dad were so wise. So that is really what the challenge in parenting a small child is helping them begin to understand consequences. So you begin by imposing immediate consequences so that they gradually figure out there are natural long-term consequences that are built into every action. So let me develop this whole idea of consequences before we kind of get into real practical stuff. The term consequences that we use, it's got different terms that have been used to describe it in different cultures. So in some cultures, it's karma. In others, it's kismet. In our culture, we'll talk about the law of cause and effect. We'll talk about the law of sowing and reaping. All of those are talking about consequences, natural consequences that are built into kind of the laws of the universe, the laws of life. The danger for many people when they think of karma or consequences is they only think in terms of negative. So you do this action, there's going to be a negative consequence. And that's very true, but it's only one side of the whole consequence picture. Because there's also positive consequences for positive actions. So we want to keep this balanced picture, not just focus on negative consequences, which is very easy to do. The next thing that I think is important to do is to see the areas that create consequences. So it's not just action. So that definitely, there are natural consequences to every action that I do. But there are 5 other areas that create consequences. So my words, my speech, what I say has a profound impact on people for good or harm. What I think has consequences. What I spend my time thinking about, that's going to have huge negative or positive consequences. So my thoughts, I have to now think about that they have consequences. I can't just think about anything I want. My beliefs and my values. What I believe has consequences. What I value has consequences. But then people in authority, they have to understand that how they use their authority has consequences, not just on them, but on everybody under their authority. Huge now ramifications for the use of authority when it comes to consequences. And then we're understanding epigenetics. And it's basically saying that the stress that a child and an infant are under has consequences on how the genes express themselves. And so there's consequences even at a very, very young age from the stressful environment that a person is in. The next thing is how consequences show up. So consequences show up, first of all, in guilt, in my conscience. So I tell a lie. One of the first areas where I'm going to experience a consequence is I'm going to feel some guilt. I'm going to feel, oh, that was wrong. It's going to bother me. So that's a consequence. But it can also show up in my body. I can go out and live a certain lifestyle. I can go out and engage in extreme sports. I can go out and live a very stressful lifestyle. That's going to take its toll on my body. That's going to gradually do damage in my body. There are going to be consequences in my body. It's also going to have consequences in my emotions. So if I'm constantly under stress, if I'm constantly in danger, if I'm constantly in a chaotic environment, it's going to affect my emotional state. And it's going to have consequences in my emotional state. What we know from complex trauma is being in that constantly dangerous environment of fear, of uncertainty, of feeling overwhelmed, this I can't handle, is the child adapts, but that means they have to shut down parts of their soul. They have to damage themselves. So there are consequences in your body, consequences in your emotions, consequences in your core, in your soul, then in your mind. Your brain develops a default setting because of the environment it's in, because of the connection or lack of connection that it has, because of what its life experiences are saying is the truth, even though they might be a lie. Therefore, the person's mind is developing a subconscious default setting, templates about how to go about life. That could be very unhealthy. But those are the consequences of all their early childhood experiences. Then a child is going to have mental health consequences from all of that stuff. Then it's going to affect their relationships moving forward. There's going to be consequences in all their relationships because the tools they use, the templates of the people they're drawn to, how they respond to different things in that relationship are been determined by early actions in their life. And now they're going to experience the consequences of all of that 20, 30, 40 years later. And then there'll be consequences in the community, consequences in the culture. So what I want you to see is that what happens to me, there are consequences that affect me biologically, psychologically, socially, spiritually. They affect every aspect of life. So consequences are not just stuff that happens in the external world. Consequences affect every fabric of every part of life. That is what we want people to understand. There's a ripple effect into every corner of life. The next important thing to understand about consequences, and we've referred to this already, is there's really two types. There's immediate consequences and there's long-term consequences. Now, what's important to understand is that the immediate consequences could seem quite different from the long-term consequences. So, for example, a child tells a lie. The immediate consequence often is very positive. They get what they want. They avoid getting into trouble. But the long-term consequences are very negative. People don't trust them. People turn against them. Life gets very difficult for them. So the immediate consequence looked very positive, but the long-term consequence is very negative. So let's go back to just an example of this. Let's say a child decides to tell the truth. So instead of lying, I'm going to tell the truth. Well, your immediate consequence could be positive. You could get validated for telling the truth, but the immediate consequence could be very negative. You could get punished. So let's say you break a window and you decide to tell the truth, and now you get punished for it. So what was the point of telling the truth? It only led to more pain. Or you tell the truth, and now your friends think you're disloyal because you ratted them out. And your friends turn against you. You got them into trouble. So telling the truth could have immediate consequences that are very painful, very negative. But what about long-term consequences for telling the truth? People respect you. People find you trustworthy. You can build solid, healthy intimacy, healthy relationships. All positive in the long term. But it's getting through that short-term stuff that can have a very opposite and make you conclude the wrong conclusions to what the long-term shows as the actual truth. Let me take it to the example of an athlete. So an athlete has a goal. They want to be, let's say, in the Olympics on a professional sports team. So to do that, they have to work hard every day. They got to work out for long hours. They got to have strict eating and sleeping regimen. They got to restrict their partying. All of those things that everybody else is doing, they have to decide not to do it. So they decide not to do all of that, to have this very strict regimen, to work out hard. What are the immediate consequences of that? They could get both positive and negative. They could feel good about themselves. They could start to get noticed and do well in sports and get positive validation from that. But there's also a lot of physical pain they're going to now have. They also have this very restrictive life where they can't have a whole lot of fun. They now have a very boring routine. They can't do what all their friends are doing. That limits their friendships, and some friends just decide not to hang around with them anymore. Positive and negative in the immediate consequences. But then long term, they stick to this. They decide this is going to be worth it. I have to stick at it even though it's hard, even though I'm losing friends, even though there's physical pain. They get in the Olympics. They get on a professional sports team. They make good living. They set records. It's a very positive thing in the end, but very mixed in the short term. Let me give you another example. Think of a farmer. A farmer, initially they plant the plants, they water them, they weed them, they spend lots of money on machinery, and then they wait. That's immediate consequences of all of that is a lot of just very negative. Costs them a lot of money. It's a lot of hard work. It's a lot of sitting in the unknown. Is this crop going to work out? Lots of sacrifices. No immediate rewards at all. Long-term consequence, man, you could get a bumper crop. You could do really well. So what I want you to see is that when you look at life and you look at the choices you make, any accomplishing of a wonderful goal So that's the long-term consequence, requires mixed immediate consequences, some positive, some negative. And you're going to have times where it all feels negative consequences, that there's no rewards, there's nothing but sacrifice, nothing but hard work, nothing but pain. You have to have the long-term consequence as the guide. And so the long-term consequence is the cortex brain. It is the brain that looks at life big picture. The limbic brain only sees the short-term consequence, the immediate consequences, and makes decisions based on that. And so the key thing in parenting is to get the child beyond the limbic brain, because it will never make good decisions. It only thinks of short term. It is getting to the cortex, seeing the big picture of life, seeing how life works, getting the goal of the healthy consequence, and then being willing to do what is necessary to reach that goal, even though it means times of painful immediate consequences. That is the challenge of life. Now, let's bring in complex trauma, because complex trauma just takes this whole gradually learning about consequences and learning to live out of your cortex and learning to live in light of long-term consequences, and it messes that up. So let me develop this for you. The first thing that happens in complex trauma is a child is in an environment that is dangerous. And so they have to be in their limbic brain. They have to be in survival mode. They have to do things to keep themselves safe now. And that is an instant gratification thing. I got to safety. So they're adapting all the time. They are learning to wear masks, to not be authentic, to keep secrets, to not open up to people, to not trust people, to manipulate people, to people please, to tell lies. All of those things, they're necessary for survival. Those are all their adaptations. And what happens is, in the short term, they look to be very positive. They look to be the right move. They have immediate positive consequences. It keeps the child safe. It gets their needs met. It helps them to connect to a degree. It helps them to get some respect and to get some love. They seem to work. It's not till 20 or 30 years later that they start to experience the negative consequences of those adaptations. They start to realize that those were actually maladaptations. They are leading to more and more pain in their life. So complex trauma forces a child to have to adapt. Those adaptations give immediate positive consequences. And it's not till 20 or 30 years later that you begin to realize, wow, those are all negative. And it is doing nothing but bringing pain into my life. Now, it's so important to understand that the child that adapted at 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, they didn't tell lies, they didn't manipulate, they didn't keep secrets because they wanted to, because they thought it was a good idea, that that's the kind of person they wanted to be. No, they did it because that's all they knew how to do to survive. Those were the only tools available to them. They weren't saying, oh, I want to become this very unhealthy, bad person that nobody trusts and everybody turns against. They're going, no, I have to stay safe now. And so all of the adaptations aren't their fault. It's not they chose it because they had a full understanding of life and a full understanding of long-term. They were thinking short-term survival. So, got to take that further. Initially, it's not their fault that they chose to lie. They chose to keep secrets. They chose to manipulate. It's not their fault. That's what they had to do to survive. But they reach a point in adult life where they begin to realize, hey, I'm in a safe environment now. I don't need to lie. I don't need to wear masks. I don't need to manipulate. If I continue to lie now, that's on me. If I continue to manipulate now, that's on me. I am now responsible to change my way of relating to people. From the old adaptations, which I now see are maladaptations, I now have to choose a different lifestyle. And if I don't, that is now on me. It is now my fault for the behavior that I'm choosing. So they were initially forced into that behavior. It wasn't really their choice, but now they are in a place where they can choose whether they continue that behavior or not. The second piece, and we've talked about, is the limbic brain is running the show in the child's life, but also in complex trauma. So the limbic brain is constantly in the driver's seat. It has to be in the driver's seat, not just because it's a child, because they need to survive, because there's danger everywhere. So the cortex doesn't develop properly. And the child doesn't transition from being governed by the limbic brain to a mature adult who's governed by the cortex. They get to adulthood still governed by the limbic brain. And as long as that is happening, they are still making decisions based on instant gratification, not based on long-term consequences. And so they are never going to make good decisions. They're always going to make decisions that give immediate positive consequences, but terrible long-term consequences. And so complex trauma sets a person up to still be governed more by their limbic brain. And so part of healing for people coming out of complex trauma is learning to recognize when your limbic brain is in power, then being able to get to your cortex brain so that your cortex brain is running the show. And that is a challenge because they've been in their limbic brain for so long. They've thought only of instant gratification, immediate consequences for so long that to transition to think of long-term consequences, to not give in to that instant gratification is very difficult. There's a third thing that comes out of complex trauma. Complex trauma trains your brain to behave a certain way. So you think of Pavlov's dog. Every time the bell rang, they knew there would be food. They began to salivate. You train animals today. You get them to do behavior, you reward them. You keep doing that, pretty soon you just give the command and they do the behavior. You can train somebody that if you do this, this will be the consequence. You do that long enough, pretty soon they'll do that and they just expect that that consequence will be there. So a good consequence trains them to do a certain behavior. But we also know that a bad consequence will train them to do a bad behavior or to stay in a bad behavior. So you look at fish that were able to swim through the whole tank. Then all of a sudden you put glass in the middle and they can't see it. But every time now they go to swim across the tank, they bump into the glass, they get hurt. They keep trying that until they begin to realize there's glass there. Every time I get to the middle of the tank, I get hurt. Now you take the glass away. The fish will swim up to the middle of the tank, but they'll never try to go beyond it because they're expecting glass there. You have trained them through painful consequences that they should never go there. And so you can train somebody through positive consequences, through negative consequences, to a certain type of behavior. So what happens in complex trauma? You can train a child through painful responses that this behavior is bad. You can train a child through positive rewards to do a certain behavior, and that could be a good behavior or could be a bad behavior. And complex trauma mistrains people by consequences, by rewarding stuff. So, for example, a child desires to be authentic. Something in them knows that that's a healthy thing to do. So they're authentic, but they keep getting punished for it. It's like the fish trying to swim across the tank. They keep bumping into this pain wall. So they begin to go, okay, never be authentic. It always results in pain. Or they get validated for the wrong thing. They get rewarded for the wrong thing. They get rewarded for their body. They get rewarded for only working hard, for only helping people. And so now they go, all my value comes from my body, from producing, from being productive. It doesn't come from who I am. They have been trained through the use of consequences to develop the wrong approach to life. Another one is a child naturally hopes. So now, every time in complex trauma, they get their hopes up that they're going to get love, their needs are going to get met. It doesn't happen. They get pain. So after a while, they go, stop hoping. Hope is a bad thing. It always results in getting hurt. And so training that turns out to be mistraining through the wrong use of pain, the wrong use of validation, can train a child in a very unhealthy lifestyle. And that's what happens in complex trauma. So what happens when those fish in the fish tank, you take the glass away and you go, it's all clear now. You can swim across the whole aquarium. Nope, not even going to try. I have been hurt too many times. And that's what happens to people with complex trauma. They come into recovery and you go, it's safe here now. You can be authentic. Nope, not going to try. Hey, we work by a different set of rules and a different set of consequences here. You can get hope again. Nope, not even going to try to get hope because I always get hurt. Let's just sabotage everything. And so complex trauma just messes that up. The next thing that comes out of this training is what's happening when you're training something is the brain is creating a brain circuit. So think of learning to throw a ball, learning to ride a bike. There's many different steps, parts to throwing a ball, pieces to the process. Same as riding a bike. And so when you first start to do it, you feel so uncoordinated. You can't get it right. It's just a disaster. You fall, you fail, because there's so many pieces to get coordinated together smoothly. So it requires intense practice, intense concentration. You have to do it over and over and over again until the brain gradually begins to piece together all of the different pieces and how to make them flow together. And it keeps working on it. And as it's doing it, it's developing a circuit in the brain that's getting this refined, that's getting this fine-tuned. And then once you've practiced it to such a point, you can start to do it without even thinking about it. The brain now goes from this being a conscious, focused activity to something you can do subconsciously. You can do it and you can be talking to others and you can ride a bike because you can do it subconsciously, autopilot. So what I want you to understand is this. Once that brain circuit has been produced and reinforced, the brain then puts an axon sheath around it to just protect it even more. Once you trigger the initial event, so you get on the bike, you put your left foot on the left pedal and get ready to mount the bike, all of a sudden that fires off the brain circuit. And then the rest just starts to flow. You put your foot you straddle the bike, put your foot on the other pedal, you get your balance, you start to pedal, it just flows. Once that brain circuit begins to fire, it's almost like gravitation takes over. It just wants to go through the whole process. And if you were to say, let's go 2 steps into the process that's part of this brain circuit and then stop it, the brain circuit go, no. We're going to go right through to the end of this brain circuit because you started not just a one action thing, you started a one action that tripped a tripwire that's got 50 actions that are now all going to flow. And so what then happens for people from complex trauma is this. When you had a certain type of danger or disrespect or not feeling heard or seen or being made to feel stupid, that triggered a brain circuit of how you would respond in actions, in your thinking, in your emotions. And you did that thousands of times. That became part of your subconscious. You just did it automatically. So now when somebody disrespects you today, or you are made to feel stupid today, that trips that circuit. And it's like a gravitational pull that wants to pull you to all of those thoughts, all of those emotions, all of those actions. And to stop that is like trying to stop a train from leaving the station after it started. It is so challenging. And so the challenge with complex trauma is it creates brain circuits, and those brain circuits have consequences. And to stop that in process is very difficult. Now, there's another piece that adds to the challenge of this, and that's the chemical dopamine. So what happens when you're training a dog is you get it to do an action, and then you give it some food. That food is a reward, and that reward gives dopamine in the brain. That's what makes it feel like a reward. There's a pleasure there. But what's important to understand is that dopamine doesn't just create pleasure, it's now attached to a memory. And the whole point is this: the reward is related to memories that the brain thinks are necessary for survival. It thinks if I repeat that thing, then I'm going to stay alive, stay healthy. So it gives pleasure now to stuff necessary for survival. But what happens if the brain gets it wrong? Gets the wrong things necessary for survival as what it thinks is necessary for survival. So let's take a child from complex trauma who's gone through nothing but pain and emptiness, and all of a sudden they find drugs. All of a sudden they find food. And they go, that feels so good. That meets needs. That makes me feel good. Okay, let's get dopamine here because we think this is necessary for survival. So now you think of a crack addict, and now even before they use, which will give them dopamine, but even before they use and they think about going out to score, they start getting dopamine in their brain. They start getting a rush, and they haven't even used yet. Why? Because the brain is saying, yes, follow through on this because this is necessary for survival. It's already rewarding them before they've actually partaken in using the drugs. So dopamine now, if it creates mistrained systems in the brain that say, when you think about this, I'm going to give you rewards already because this is necessary for survival. And so I'm going to start giving you good consequences right now and instant gratification, when that could lead to terrible consequences long term. So dopamine systems can be mistrained is the point, and can give wonderful instant gratification but terrible long-term consequences. So let's take it a bit farther. Many children from complex trauma had inconsistent consequences. So some days Dad got mad at them when they did something, other days Dad did nothing, other days Dad praised them. Some days they had, for a good action, some days positive responses, some days negative responses. For a bad action, some days they got punished for it, some days they got away with it. Inconsistent, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. And so what can happen with inconsistent consequences is you're not sure what to believe. Is this an actual consequence that's going to consistently happen every time? Because if it does, then I either stop doing it or I keep doing it. But what happens if sometimes I get rewarded for a bad consequence? Sometimes I don't get rewarded. Sometimes I don't get rewarded for a good consequence. Sometimes I actually get paid for a good consequence, for a good behavior. So it's all confusing. So what do I do? And that's complex trauma. And so what we have found with addiction issues is addictions that give inconsistent consequences are some of the hardest addictions to break. So take, for example, gambling. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. what does that always do in the brain? Well, maybe I'll win this time. Maybe it'll be worth it this time. Or I've had a series of bad luck. Maybe it's about time I'm going to get good luck. It creates a false hope. Because always growing up in complex trauma, there would always be a positive consequence at some point if I just kept trying long enough. And so complex trauma for many people was all about inconsistent consequences. And that can really mess up as you move forward in thinking about consequences. There's another aspect of complex trauma, and that's unfair consequences, injustice. So what about the child who constantly tried to do the right thing and always got punished for it? They kept trying to be authentic. They kept trying to be honest. They kept trying to be open and vulnerable and totally human, and they kept getting punished for it. Or they did something bad and the punishment didn't suit the crime. It was over the top. It was unfair. It was too harsh. What happens in a child where the consequences are not fair? After a while, you just shut down. You just harden your heart. You go, who cares? Life isn't fair. I'm just going to do whatever I want. Short-term pleasure is better than nothing because I'm going to get pain. It's not going to be fair. I'm just going to take this little bit of pleasure I can get, and who cares about anything else? It really shapes the thinking in a very destructive way. But that comes out of complex trauma. Then there's another piece that comes out of complex trauma for some, and that is the spoiled child. Parents who never let the child experience negative consequences, who never imposed negative consequences. Parents who took negative consequences away. They paid off the police. They talked people out of tickets. They talked to teachers and threatened to stop supporting the school if they didn't pass the child. All kinds of things parents did so the child would not have to experience pain, and the parents thought it was being loving. But what was happening to the child? The child was thinking, I can do whatever I want, and there's either nothing bad ever going to happen, so there's no such thing as consequences, or I can wiggle out of every situation. So yeah, some bad stuff might start to happen, but I'm pretty sure I can find a way to wiggle out, to get somebody to get me out of it. So a child coming out of being spoiled, consequences doesn't carry the weight it should in their decision-making processes. They just, again, get preoccupied with instant gratification and don't even think long-term consequences should be factored in. There's one other piece here to complex trauma, and we've already talked about it. I just want to develop it a bit farther, and it's this. The adaptations they have to have gave instant, immediate, positive consequences. They didn't experience the negative consequences long-term until 20 to 30 years later. There was that 20 to 30 year delay. Now, the key that I want to focus on is this. It wasn't like 20 or 30 years later, on one day, all of the negative consequences showed up full-blown, full impact, and hit them between the eyes. No, it's not how it works. It's like they're going 20, 30 years later, and all of a sudden they start to notice, oh, there's a negative consequence here happening when I tell a lie, when I'm not respectful, when I manipulate people. But there's still positive consequences. So their consequences show up gradually, the negative, but they're still being offset by all the positive consequences that are still coming out of lying and manipulating. So I think an illustration that might help you understand this is like, think of a great big swimming pool of crystal clear water, and at 5-year-old, you take a little eyedropper of ink and you squirt it into the pool. It looks like there's zero consequence. Pool is still crystal clear. The next day, you put a little dropper of ink in the pool, and it goes on and on and on, and you don't begin to experience the negative consequences of the eyedropper of ink until years later. When you start to go, the pool's a bit, I don't like the color of the pool. But yeah, it's still safe. There's still a lot of positive. So that delayed experience of the consequences that show up very gradually, and the positives still outweigh the negatives for many years. That's the reality of complex trauma and the experience of long-term consequences. But then we have some tendencies when that starts to happen. Our brain tends to focus on accenting the positive benefits that we're still getting and minimizing, denying, or rationalizing the negative. So we choose to see life in a skewed way where we overemphasize, yeah, but look how positive it is, and underemphasize the negative. We don't see life accurately. Then the next tendency is once life starts delivering negative consequences, our first response is to blame others, not to see it as the consequence of choices we've made. So that's another way of avoiding looking at life accurately. Then the next thing we do is we minimize the severity of the negative consequence. Well, it's not that bad. So we're still not seeing life accurately. And then for some people out of complex trauma, they've been in a fantasy world for so long that they can escape into fantasy that there'll be no negative consequences, that it'll be all positive. And that's their way of denying reality. So what I want you to see is what comes out of complex trauma is this slow experience of consequences. Positives still outweigh the negatives. They show up very gradually. We have all of these tendencies within us to not look at life accurately. And so that's why change, facing consequences, listening to consequences, and actually changing our behavior doesn't happen overnight. And so the stages of change model came into existence because of all of this. And basically it says we start in denial, pre-contemplation, go, no, it's not a big deal. Don't have a problem here. Then we go to contemplation where we go, I'm getting a few negative consequences, but the positives are still outweighing the negatives. So I'm ambivalent. I think I'm going to need to change, but I still got so many positives. I'm sitting on the fence. I really don't think I want to change yet. I wonder if there's a way I can minimize the negative consequences I'm experiencing and maximize the positives that I'm experiencing. And that's where the brain spends most of its time. But then the negative consequences begin to pile up. Soon they're starting to outweigh the positive consequences. We're getting more pain than positive. And so then we get to the preparation stage and we go, I think I need to change. But do you realize that could take years before we get from pre-contemplation to preparation? That we can be in contemplation stage, sitting on the fence, with the positives outweighing the negatives in our mind for years before we actually get to the preparation stage where we go, I think I need to change. What's that going to involve? Well, then we can be in the preparation stage for years because we go, am I willing to count the cost? Am I willing to put the work in? Am I willing to make these changes? I'm willing to do this stuff? I don't know if I am. Maybe it'd be easier to go back. Maybe I'm missing something where I can still get positives and minimize the negatives. Before we get to the action stage, before we actually face honestly the long-term consequences and look at life accurately, we can spend years in the stages of change. And that's the reality of what comes out of complex trauma, is we don't look at consequences properly. It takes us a long time to get to the point where we actually do. Once we do, we can begin to grow. So let me just talk about that briefly. What's involved in getting healthy? So the bottom line is this: you cannot get healthy until you see life accurately. As long as you're denying, minimizing, rationalizing, blaming all the negative consequences on others, you're never going to get healthy. You have to begin to see that my behaviors are producing negative consequences. I can't blame, I can't minimize, I can't rationalize. The one leads to the other. I have to change. That is so difficult, but so important. But secondly, it's learning to live out of your cortex. It's learning to let your cortex trump your limbic brain, to let your cortex be in the driver's seat. But let me say, this is a slow, gradual process. This is having a war in your brain for years as you develop the skills and tools for your cortex to be in the driver's seat, to be the administrator of your life. Be patient with yourself. Develop the ability when you realize you're in your limbic to ground yourself, to get into your cortex. Develop the mindfulness skills to be aware of whether you're in your limbic or in your cortex, to be aware of what's happening inside of you. So you got to be patient with yourself. Undoing all the damage of complex trauma when it comes to consequences doesn't happen overnight. It is a gradual process. You're rebuilding brain circuits. You're reprogramming your subconscious mind. There's a lot of tools. It takes time. A big part of this, though, and this is where it gets really practical, is you're developing internal boundaries. You're basically saying, I'm not going to stay in bed and sleep all day, even though my limbic brain wants to, and that would give me immediate positive consequences. No, I'm going to force myself to get up, even though to me that would be painful immediate consequences, because I know the long-term consequences are positive. I am not going to have this extra helping of food. I am going to force myself to exercise. I'm going to force myself to meditate. I am going to develop daily habit and routine to meet my 12 needs, to keep myself healthy, that may not give instant gratification, immediate positive consequences, but I know give me positive long-term consequences. I am going to build a life that leads to positive long-term consequences, that is not shaped by immediate positive consequences, instant gratification. And so I need filters. I need internal boundaries in everything that I do. I need to think through life. And much of what we do in our LIFT program is helping people begin to understand and live life out of their cortex, not their limbic brain. One of the pieces to this is that a lot of people, when they start thinking of consequences, just focus on the behaviors that led to bad consequences. Okay, I overeat, I spend too much time watching TV, and they just try to stop unhealthy behaviors. And what I want people to do is, that's part one, but now you got to replace it with a healthy behavior. So instead of just saying I need to stop watching so much TV or playing video games all day, what will I replace it with? What will be the new hobby, the new activity that I enjoy, that feeds my soul, that helps me connect? What will I replace it with? And as I focus on that, that can be so helpful in motivating me to want to continue to do this stuff. So healthy activities will give instant gratification, positive immediate consequences of connection, of feeling better about myself, of not having a guilty conscience. But they also give long-term healthy consequences as well. And so I'm finding stuff that does give some instant gratification, positive benefits, even though there's going to be hard work and sacrifice, and also long-term consequences. Another way is to go really big picture, and we'll end with this, and it's basically think of your life in terms of, instead of doing this and this being the characteristic of my life, I'd rather this be the characteristic of my life, which is the opposite. So instead of taking lives, I want to spend my life saving lives. Instead of just trying to survive, I want to thrive. Instead of being a taker, I want to become a giver. I want that to mark my life. Instead of using my words to hurt and divide, I want to use words to reconcile and to heal. Instead of my speech just being empty, superficial words. I want my speech to be meaningful and deep and life-giving. So what do I want to characterize my life? Let's think of consequences in terms of that. So this whole idea of consequences to me is such an essential part of a healthy life. It's such a essential part of parenting and reparenting, but it is complicated. There's a lot of pieces that need to be thought through. And I hope that what I've shared today helps you with that. And I hope it gives you some tools as you think it through and move towards building a life around healthy long-term consequences. Well, that's the end of another